Welcome to our new series, 5 Pillars of the Spiritual Life. The intention of this series is to try to give a very practical guide to very busy people about how to deepen their spiritual life. And I think there are 5 pillars that come to us not only through our church tradition, but also through the New Testament. They're ingredient to what Jesus really thinks I will bring that deeper conversion of life and that deeper manifestation of grace within our souls. And my intention here is to put it in a very accessible form, which I think people can do in a very short period of time. Before I begin, I just want to make mention of a few resources because there are going to be a lot of details given in this program that maybe some of the viewers will miss. And so just to begin with, there is a book put out by Ignatius Press called 5 Pillars of the Spiritual Life, and that replicates this series, and we will make mention of the chapters as we go throughout the book and the series. The second resource is, of course, the DVDs and the CDs that will be made available through the EWTN Religious Catalog, and the book is also available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. So what are our 5 pillars? What are these real pillars that build up and strengthen and deepen our spiritual life? The first and foremost, of course, is the Holy Eucharist. And the Holy Eucharist is, of course, the fulcrum and the center of our lives as Catholics. The second pillar is what I'm going to just call spontaneous prayers. These are very short prayers that can become conduits to grace for us in our lives. The third pillar is what I'm going to call the Beatitudes, which we're going to look at in combination with what I call the Examen prayer. It's a prayer of St. Ignatius Loyola. The fourth is partnership with the Holy Spirit. How do we cooperate with the urgings and the cajolings of the very loving Spirit that is within our hearts to cooperate with His inspiration, His guidance, His peace, and above all, His way of moving us greater and greater into our apostolic lives? And of course, the fifth pillar, the pillar which we all know, is contemplation. And specifically for you as active people, how can we be contemplatives in action? How can we, if we don't have the life of a religious or in a monastery, how can we bring that contemplative experience, that deepening experience of prayer more deeply into our lives? Before I begin with the first pillar, though, I do want to give something that's very, very important. And that is kind of an admonition for people to, as much as possible, carve some time out in their busy lives to make room for prayer, to make room for contemplation. If anything is important, it's this idea of consecrating time specifically to the Lord. Now, I know you're very, very busy people. I know frequently you don't have the time, to maybe spend on a discipline of prayer in an exact way every day. Sometimes your work is calling you earlier. Sometimes a child is sick. Sometimes things come up with the grandmother. Sometimes all sorts of things happen. And of course, you find yourself sometimes saying, I don't have a discipline. Things are kind of chaotic in my life. But the key thing to remember as we embark on the series of deepening prayer, the key thing to remember is we want to consecrate time to the Lord as best we can. So we're going to see in this particular series that what we want to do, for example, with the Holy Eucharist is we'd like to go to Mass, we'd like to receive the Holy Eucharist as often as is feasible within our lives. And of course, we know that our lives can be utterly chaotic, but that's just the key principle, is that we want to be as close to the Lord as possible in the Eucharist when we feasibly can. And then secondly, spontaneous prayers. Spontaneous prayers are kind of designed for the very busy person. But we have to remember, even though those spontaneous prayers are 5 to 10 seconds long, we actually have to remember to say them when we're in the situation in which they're appropriate. So there's a part of a discipline of remembering and remembering those prayers and remembering to say them when the situation calls for it. We see in the saints so many times, and of course in St. Paul, this idea of praying unceasingly during the day. And these spontaneous prayers, that's a way of praying unceasingly. But in order to do it, we sort of have to remember it, and remember it effortlessly, almost as if it were a habit. And then the third pillar really gets us into this idea of the Beatitudes and the examen prayer. And as I'll be saying a little bit later on, what we want to do then is we want to remember to give 5 minutes at the end of the day to this examen prayer. And I'll explain what that is later. But right now the key point is consecrating that 5 minutes at the end of the day. Even if there's noise going on, even if there's chaos all around you, even if it's just as you're kind of slumping into bed at night, to just remember that 5 minutes, even if you're dozing off to sleep halfway during that time, and frequently, by the way, I am. But remember to make that space, that consecration of time to the Lord. Now, the fourth pillar is partnership with the Holy Spirit, and that partnership is, as we'll see, again, that's for very active people. How is it that we can cooperate with the Holy Spirit? The Holy Spirit is working in your life. Believe me, the Holy Spirit's working in my life. In fact, that's the story of my life. Frankly, half the time I'm kind of trundling from one thing to the next. It really surprises me that I'm able to do anything at all. But the key thing to remember is that the Holy Spirit is focusing us. The Holy Spirit is inspiring us. The Holy Spirit is enabling us to kind of get our acts together, to seize opportunities for apostolic effectiveness and apostolic zeal in our day-to-day lives. With respect to the fifth pillar, contemplation, this is going to be a little bit more difficult because contemplation does require some time to be with God. And of course, we're very busy people once again, and so it might seem at first that, we can't really contemplate very well. We can't be like St. Teresa of Avila or St. John of the Cross or St. Ignatius of Loyola. That may well be the case. But nevertheless, we do have time to be contemplatives in action. And that requires really kind of a 10 to 15 minute starting point, as we'll be discussing. And if we implement a technique of contemplation, that technique in its turn can really help us to get focused and to be the recipient of the Lord's peace, to be the recipient of the Lord's love in that kind of contemplative moment where the Lord really has some time to infuse Himself into us through what we're doing in this contemplation. The main thing, though, is to take some time out, maybe 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes. For me, I'm a morning person. It's going to be in the morning. For other people I know, they take it in the last 10 to 15 minutes of their lunch break. Other people love the evening. Of course, I'm just practically dozing off after 9:30. That doesn't work for me. But a time in which that we can have that real reflective, contemplative space to allow the Lord to move us in His love and in His peace for maybe 10 to 15 minutes as a starting point. That's what it requires. Now, if you take a look at those 5 pillars, there's not a lot of time that we need to deepen our spiritual lives. But if we consecrate this time, whenever we can, whenever it's feasible, the Eucharist, whenever we can, whenever it's feasible, the spontaneous prayers, 5 to 10 seconds, but remembering to do them, that examen prayer, only 5 minutes at the end of the day, just taking that time out, consecrating that, and of course the partnership with the Holy Spirit, remembering the techniques which help us to cooperate, and the ways of the Holy Spirit in which we can do it, and of course the contemplative time, if we can find 10 to 15 minutes in the morning or the evening, whenever it's feasible, without giving up our families, I think then we can really make this move to deepening our spiritual lives in a very, very practical way.